Thank you, Peter. Thank you. And thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. We are really, really excited to dive into our Nebraska data. And I am going to start by sharing my screen here. And if you have ever been on a webinar or a Zoom meeting with me, you know that I like a table of contents. I like to know what I'm going to sit through or what I'm going to present. So I assume that you two that you too might enjoy doing that. And so this is what we've got coming up for the next hour. First, I'm going to make a very, very brief introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. Some of you have been volunteering with us for many years. Some of you have been donating to us for many years. So this will be old hat to you. But please understand that there are some new people on the line, and we want to just very, very briefly describe our work at the Environmental Voter Project, what we do, why we do it, how we do it, and our results. That being said, it will be brief. And so for those of you who are new, understand we're not going to go into exhaustive detail on every aspect of our work. This is just to provide sort of a foundation on which you can understand the meat of this presentation, which is number 2 that you'll see there. And that is all of the data that we have found in our research on environmental voters in Nebraska, some of the opportunities that we see, ways that you can support our work and be involved in our work, and some of the impact that I think the climate movement can have this year. And then finally, we will close with a Q&A session. So as a reminder, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A folder. You should see it either on the bar in the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen. That is where Peter will be answering questions. If he doesn't answer your question, that might be because he's holding on to it and he's going to throw it to me during the Q&A session. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And as I said, I'm going to start by just giving you a brief overview of our work. In a nutshell, what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we identify people who care deeply about climate and the environment yet don't vote, and then we turn them into better voters. That's it. That's all we do. We find environmentalists who don't vote and turn them into better voters. Now, what that also means is we don't do a lot of the stuff that you probably imagine environmental nonprofits typically doing. So for instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even, as odd as it might sound, try to convince people to care more about climate change or clean air or clean water. In fact, a good way to think about us is we're not even in the opinion changing or mind changing business at all. We don't want to try to change people's minds. Instead, we are solely in the behavior changing business. Our whole purpose at the Environmental Voter Project is that we want to bypass the hardest, messiest, most expensive part of politics, which is trying to change people's minds, and instead find the people who don't need their minds changed. Find the people who are already with us. Find the people who are dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists, yet they just aren't voting, and instead make a behavioral intervention and turn them into better voters. And as I hope to suggest to you and show to you over the next 5 or 10 minutes, this approach holds tremendous opportunities for the climate movement. And it is also an easier and cheaper way to build the political power, not just in big federal elections, but in state and local elections as well. All right. Why do we take this very unique approach? Well, it can be found in polls like this. Now, this particular poll that you're looking at is a poll from the last federal election. So it's from the 2022 midterm election. It was taken in battleground states, and likely voters were asked, what is their number one most important political priority. So as you'll see, likely voters in these battleground states, only 4% of them, 4% listed climate or other environmental issues as their number one priority. Now, maybe you're saying, oh, come on, Nathaniel, this is only one poll. But I promise you, this is no different from pretty much any other poll that you will see anywhere. In fact, if you go back to the federal election before this, the presidential election in 2020, and you look at exit polling data from that, once again, 4% of likely voters listed climate and other environmental issues as their top priority. The truth is, no matter what the election, no matter where you are, far, far too few voters list climate as a top priority. And that is a big problem that many of us in the climate and environmental movements don't want to face. Like many advocates, we like to pretend that we have more strength than we actually do. And we pound our chest that we say, oh, watch out. We're all going to flood, the polls this year and you're going to regret it. But the truth is, we don't have enough power. The climate movement doesn't have enough power. Because if you are running for office and you look at your public voter files and you look at your polling and you see that people who are actually likely to show up to vote, only 4% of them list climate as their top priority, that's a big, big problem for us. And it's a problem for the following two reasons. One, boy, does it make it hard to elect climate leaders. But two, perhaps more importantly, even when we do elect the so-called right people, boy, is it hard to convince them to then spend their precious political capital on something that only 4% of voters list as their top priority. This is, I think, a good way of thinking about it is this is a tremendous lack of demand in the political marketplace. And boy, is it hard to get policymakers and politicians to supply what we want, to supply the climate policy that we need when so few voters are demanding it. This is what we are trying to address at the Environmental Voter Project. This is the problem we are trying to address, this lack of environmental voters, this lack of political power in the climate and environmental movements. And as you can imagine, if you're dealing with a situation where there are far too few climate voters, well, there are really only two ways to try to address that, right? You could try to talk to a whole bunch of people who vote and convince them to care more about climate change. The problem with that is, even though it's important, boy, is it hard. I don't know how many of you have tried to change someone's mind about climate change lately, but it is hard. And if you're doing it as part of a campaign, it is expensive. And perhaps most importantly, it's almost impossible to test whether you change people's opinions due to a whole bunch of survey biases and things like that. But then there's another approach that we could take. We could find the people who already care about climate and the environment, yet aren't voting, and turn them into better voters. And the benefit of that approach is that whether you vote or not is public record. And so it's a little bit easier to find these people. And perhaps more importantly, we can then test by looking at public voter files which messages work best at actually getting these people to vote. And so that's the approach that we take. But even more important than those two reasons I just gave you is a third really important reason. The reason we take this particular approach to building the political power of the climate movement is because it turns out that the reason so few voters list climate as their top priority is not because too few Americans care about climate change. Actually, it turns out there are tens of millions of Americans who care so deeply about climate and the environment that they list it as their number one priority. So why aren't they showing up in polls of likely voters like this? Well, for one pretty simple reason. Turns out that people who care deeply about climate and the environment are disproportionately awful voters. We spend so much time in the climate movement thinking about persuasion, thinking about how to persuade people to change their minds and care more about climate, that we haven't realized that we actually have a much bigger turnout problem than we do a persuasion problem. And just to put some numbers on this, the Environmental Voter Project, we've estimated, building off of the identification work that we do in our 19 states and extrapolating out to all 15 states, we estimated that 13 million already registered voters who list climate as their top priority skipped the last midterm election. 13 million. Over 8 million skipped the last presidential election. These people are already registered to vote. That's not a barrier. They're already registered to vote. They list climate or other environmental issues as your top priority, and they just didn't walk out the door on election day to cast a ballot. And I imagine many of you find that frustrating. I know the feeling. Many of us at the Environmental Voter Project find this frustrating too. But as I'd like to suggest to you over the coming minutes, this is also an enormous opportunity. Because we live at a moment in time where it's become almost impossible to change people's minds about anything, but especially climate change. And what these huge populations of voters represent are people who don't need their minds changed. These are people who, like you, shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change. They are dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists. They're just not voting. What they need is a behavioral change. They need someone to come in and message to them in a way that gets them to change their behavior. And that is what we do. And again, as I've mentioned a few times tonight, this is not an introduction to the Environmental Voter Project webinar, so excuse me as I breeze over the next few minutes, but very briefly, I'm going to now describe to you how we find and then mobilize these low propensity environmental voters and some of our results. And then we're going to dive into the Nebraska data. It's a four-step process, what we do. First, we individually identify these unlikely to vote environmentalists by building what's called predictive models. Now, again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but very, very briefly, what this process entails is we poll huge numbers of people, tens of thousands of people, but we can get away with doing that cost-wise because we're only asking them one question. We say, hey, what's your number one most important political priority? And let's say in Nebraska, 1,000 people say climate or the environment. Well, then it's really easy to isolate those people who self-identified as listing climate as their top priority and start working with data scientists to figure out, okay, what do we know about these people? What voter file data is there? What census data? What publicly available behavioral and consumer data? We only use publicly available data, but there's a lot of it out there. And then we can start trying to find other people like those 1,000 who are also likely to list climate as their top priority. And it's a long, iterative process looking at lots of hidden patterns and correlations. But at the end of it, what we're able to do is assign a score from 0 to 100, telling us how likely every individual citizen in Nebraska is to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally list it as their number one priority. And I know this sounds like a convoluted process, but it's the same way that sophisticated presidential and Senate and congressional campaigns now individually target voters. And we test the you-know-what out of these models, and they are extraordinarily accurate. All right, so if you want to find out more about how we identify these voters, we have a very short YouTube video, and Peter will put a link in the chat that goes through in more detail how we individually identify these voters. But for now, just know we can individually identify people with a super high likelihood of listing climate as their top priority. Then we don't need fancy data scientists to tell us which of those environmentalists are unlikely to vote. That's public record. Whether you vote or not is public record. So then we cross-reference these environmentalists with their public voting histories, and now we've isolated a group of people who we know care deeply about climate and the environment, yet are unlikely to vote. And not to be creepy about it, but like we literally know these people by name and street address. We've identified them on voter files. This allows us to go to step 2, mobilization. Now we've got this population of people who don't need to be convinced to care more about climate. They don't need to be educated on climate or clean air or clean water or environmental justice. Like they are already there. They're just not voting. And so now, I mean, we can afford to be completely agnostic with our messaging. We don't need to talk about climate if it doesn't work. We don't need to talk about anything if it doesn't work. And on the other hand, we can pick and choose from all the latest cutting edge behavioral science and message to these people in any way that we think is appropriate if it does one thing and one thing only, and that is get their rear ends out the door on election day. I often like to say, like, we would talk about chocolate chip cookies if that's the message that would get these people to vote. And so what we do is we work with thousands of volunteers, at last count well over 6,000, to canvass and call and mail these voters. We also do digital ads and direct mail campaigns built by our staff members. We run hundreds of randomized control trials each year, isolating which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists, so that we know, both for our donors and our volunteers, that the messages we are delivering are optimized to do one thing and one thing only, and that is turn these non-voting environmentalists into super voters. Step 3, habit reinforcement. You don't need to be a behavioral science nerd like us to be able to intuitively understand that it's really hard to change someone's habits if you only talk to them once every 2 or 4 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. That's just not how you change people's habits. No, if you want to turn people into habitual voters, you need to talk to them at every possible opportunity. And so at the Environmental Voter Project, we take this third step, habit reinforcement, very, very seriously. We work year-round in elections big and small, primaries, generals, specials, local, state, federal, any election, even like library trustee races, we're going to use that as an opportunity to talk to these non-voting environmentalists. And just as an example, we've already been active in 137 different elections just this year, just since January 1st, 2024. 137. And I freely admit that many, if not most of those elections had nothing to do with environmental policymaking. But they had everything to do with changing people's behavior and changing their habits. Our approach at EVP is if you're in the business of trying to turn non-voters into voters, how dare you let any election pass you by without using it as an opportunity to talk to these people? Because ultimately that leads us to step 4, changing the electorate. Ultimately, what we want to do is so dramatically increase the number of environmental voters, not non-voters, but voters, so that anybody running for anything up or down the ballot looks at the voter file or looks at their polling data and says, holy moly, where did all these environmental voters come from? Because if that happens, politicians will begin to lead on climate, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but rather because nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. And so politicians always end up going where the votes are. Not because they're bad, not because they're cynical, but because you don't get to be a politician unless you get 50% plus one of the votes. It's the brutal arithmetic of how democracy works. And so our approach at EVP, is we know we need more political power in the climate and environmental movements. So we are going to dramatically increase the number of consistent climate and environmental voters and just trust that politicians really like to get elected. All right. If you want more information about what we do at the Environmental Voter Project, you can find a link in our chat and go to environmentalvoter.org/about. Very briefly, I'm going to run through our results doing this work, and then we're going to jump in to Nebraska data. We measure our impact in two ways. The first is our impact in specific one-off elections. The way we measure our impact here is through what's called randomized controlled trials. And I'm going to walk you through how these work. So let's take an example. Let's take Nebraska. Let's say we identify 100,000 registered voters in Nebraska who care deeply about climate and the environment, yet are unlikely to vote. What we do not do is immediately start messaging to all 100,000 of them. Instead, before we talk to a single one of them, we randomly separate that group into two groups. One is a control group. The other is called a treatment, or sometimes it's called an intervention group. Usually it's about an 85 to 15% split, and about 15% are in that control group. And what we do with that control group is we set it aside and we never talk to them. Now, the remaining 85%, these are the low propensity environmental voters that we canvass and call and send postcards and direct mail and digital ads to, all with behavioral science informed messaging designed to get them to vote. Then the election happens. And a few months later, and I know I sound like a broken record, but I'm going to say it again, a magical thing happens. And that is public voter files are updated. Remember, whether you vote or not is public record. And so after the election, what we are then able to see is how many of the low propensity environmental voters in our control group voted. That's the group we did not message to. And then compare it to how many low propensity environmental voters in our treatment group voted. That's the group that we did message to. And what this process then enables us to do is isolate what our sole impact was on turnout while controlling for all outside variables, right? Like if it rained in Omaha and that depressed turnout, well, there's pretty much the same percentage of Omaha residents in our control group as there is in our treatment group. We controlled for that with this initial random separation process. You might say, well, what if a political campaign spends $1 billion going after environmental voters? Well, we've controlled for that too. Unless the Biden campaign hacks into our system and decides to only talk to people in our treatment group, but nobody in our control group, like we've controlled for all those outside variables. That's the beauty of a randomized control trial. And just over the last 4 years, we have now been active in probably close to 900 different elections. Now, many of them were small elections where because we were only targeting a few thousand or tens of thousands of voters, we weren't able to isolate what's called statistically significant results. Another way of saying that is we weren't able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the results weren't just due to random occurrence. We couldn't prove that we were actually solely responsible. But in dozens of elections, we have been able to show that. And just in these 19 states, these are the 19 states that we work in, just over these last 4 years in 2020, and 21, and 22, and 23, we expanded into Nebraska last year in 2023. You'll see we've been able to show that the Environmental Voter Project was solely responsible for increasing turnout over our control group, as much as 1.8 percentage points in statewide general elections, as much as 3.6 percentage points in statewide primaries, and as much as 5.7 percentage points in local elections. Now, these might not sound like big numbers to you, but ask Donald Trump how big a deal 1.8 percentage points is in Pennsylvania, and he'll tell you. These are big numbers in this business. And any of our donors who are watching right now, and any of our volunteers who are watching right now, you should be incredibly proud that we have been able to isolate what your sole impact was on turnout while controlling for all of the other organizations and all of the other campaigns and all of the billions of other dollars that have been spent mobilizing voters in these elections. That's how powerful this messaging is, and that's how powerful your support and your indefatigable volunteer efforts are. All right. Finally, let me just go over the second way that we measure our impact on turnout, and this is over the long term. Since the Environmental Voter Project launched our one city proof of concept, now at the end of 2015 and then all through 2016, then we launched for good in 2017. So since then, we have now spoken to over 9.5 million unique individual voters, all of whom, by definition, were super environmentalists who were unlikely to vote in an election, or else we wouldn't have been talking to them, right? Well, as of the last time we took this measurement, which was now about a year ago, we're actually updating this measurement right now, and we'll be releasing a new version of it soon. But as of the last time we took this measurement, of those 9.5 million low propensity, many of whom were complete non-voters who care about the environment, 1.5 million of them had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They had become super voters. They had become such consistent super voters that if you were running for dog catcher, you would look at the voter file and you'd say, oh, whew, that guy's going to vote. Got to definitely go and talk to him, figure out what issues he cares about. We helped turn these people into super voters. Now, I do just want to say one caveat. This second way that we measure our impact over the long term, this is different from the previous metric, the randomized control trial. I cannot claim that in this long-term metric that we are solely responsible for turning 1.5 million non-voters into super voters. In fact, we most surely are not solely responsible for this result, but we're pretty darn responsible. There's no other organization that's now been active in close to 2,000 elections over the last 8 years, doing everything it takes to turn these non-voters into super voters. And we're very, very proud of this. All right. If you want more information on our results, you can go to environmentalvoter.org/results, and the link will be in the chat. Let's get into the Nevada data, the real reason the Nebraska data, not Nevada. I really like saying Nevada data. Sorry, Nebraska data. Here we go. If you are not already aware of this, there is one really important reason. Now, I'm going to show you a whole bunch of important reasons to care about Nebraska this year. But I ran into someone the other day and was having a conversation with them about the importance of Nebraska. And they were totally blown away when I started describing what I'm going to describe to you. And I'll be honest, I actually just thought a lot of people were aware of this, and I wasn't going to put it into this presentation. And then I spoke to this person. I'm like, okay, we need to spell this out here. So for those of you who are already aware of this, please forgive me. But for those of you who aren't, here is one of the biggest reasons Nebraska is important this year. You all know what this is, right? This is the Electoral College map. We've got a presidential election coming up in 209 days, right? As things currently stand, North Carolina is a swing state, but it's leaning Republican. Georgia, also leaning Republican. Arizona, leaning Republican. Nevada, leaning Republican. Does this mean that this is how these states are going to end up? No, of course not. But if the election were today, this might be the results. All right, let's go to the upper Midwest. Pennsylvania might be leaning a little blue, same as Wisconsin. We don't know about Michigan, but this is called the blue wall, so let's just say Michigan goes blue as well. This is a very likely path to what will happen, right? But look what that leaves us with up top here. 268 electoral college votes for Donald Trump, 269 for Joe Biden. And what's the magic number for becoming president? 270. What's missing? This. Just like Maine, Nebraska is one of two states that awards 2 electoral college votes to the candidate who wins the state, and then an individual electoral college vote for the candidate who wins each individual congressional district. And it just so happens that the 2nd congressional district of Nebraska is not only super close, it is probably one of the 5 most evenly matched super close congressional races and congressional districts in the country. But as you can see, it could very easily determine the next president of the United States. If the map ends up looking like this, and Joe Biden wins that 1 electoral vote around Omaha, he gets to magic 270. If Donald Trump wins this, the Electoral College is a tie. It is thrown to the House of Representatives, where each state gets 1 vote based on which party controls the most congressional seats in that state. That is an election that Donald Trump would win. This is one of the reasons that Nebraska is so crucially important. All right, let's look at what our data says about Nebraska this year. Remember I described to you how we identify low propensity environmental voters? We build these predictive models on voter files and then individually identify these people. Well, this year we have identified 44,046 already registered voters who are likely to list climate or the environment as their #1 priority, yet they are unlikely to vote this fall. And basically what that means is they didn't vote in the 2020 presidential election or any election since then. So we've deemed them to be unlikely to vote this fall. They need this robust mobilization campaign. All right. What does that number mean? What does 44,000 mean in Nebraska? Well, 4 years ago in the presidential election, a little bit fewer than 1 million ballots were cast. So this is actually a relatively big number. And the margin in the presidential election, even though Nebraska was not terribly close statewide in the presidential, was only about 4.5 times larger than this number of low propensity environmental voters we've identified. As you'll see, there are a lot of competitive elections coming up in Nebraska, a lot of state legislative elections. We'll get into some of that. Certainly that Nebraska 2nd congressional district, and we're going to get into some data on that. The presidency, because of that 2nd district. And also, as many of you know, Nebraska is a public power state. Power generation is publicly owned. And that means there are elected public utility commissioners and public utility board members who often make decisions about things like, I don't know, whether to shut down a coal-fired power plant or whether to change the mix in the electricity that's generated in a particular district. A lot of those elections are coming up, many of them on May 14th to coincide with the state primary, and many again on November 5th with the general election. These are some of the races that we've got our eyes on. But in particular, that 2nd congressional district, which we're going to jump into more detail in a second. But before we do that, I want to tell you about these 44,046 low propensity environmental voters, because we have a demographic breakdown of them down here. I want to describe to you what this chart means here at the bottom. And so the first thing I want you to do is actually look at the very bottom row, please. The row that says reg voters. That's registered voters. What this is a demographic cross-section of all registered voters in Nebraska. So you'll see this means that 9.5% of registered voters in Nebraska are age 18 to 24. 16% are age 25 to 34. And you'll see here, we've got some demographic data on the sex breakdown and demographic data on racial breakdowns. Then the row above that, LPEVs, that stands for low propensity environmental voters. These are the voters we are targeting. These registered voters who care deeply about climate and the environment, yet are unlikely to vote this fall without a robust effort to get them to vote. All right. Let's get into who these people are. Who are these low propensity environmental voters? Now that we have a baseline of all registered voters to compare that to. The first thing you'll notice, they're disproportionately young. That probably comes as no surprise to you. But you'll see almost 70% of these low propensity environmental voters in Nebraska are under the age of 35. And you'll see, if you look at all registered voters in Nebraska, only 25.5% of them are under the age of 35. So this is a big, big difference. About a quarter of registered voters are under 35 in Nebraska, but almost three-quarters of the low propensity environmental voters in Nebraska are that age. But it's not as simple as the older you get, the less likely you are to care deeply about climate. Because look, it bumps up again among voters who are 65 and older. And that's not an anomaly. That's something that we see in every single one of our states. And to be clear, that has nothing to do with vote propensity. We're not seeing that bump because there are a whole bunch of older people who don't vote. No, we're seeing that bump because there are a whole bunch of older people who care deeply about climate and the environment. And we're seeing that in all of our states. If you go to our website, environmentalvoter.org/reports, you'll see one of our most recent reports is called Gray is the New Green. And it dives into a lot of this data showing how people 65 and older are now the second largest age group to care about climate and the environment after 18 to 34-year-olds. Okay, you'll see there's a slight gender gap going on, both among registered voters and low propensity environmental voters. But you'll also note that we have a lot of unknown data. And that's because elections offices in Nebraska don't always ask people for sex data when they register to vote. Private data vendors try to fill in that data for us, but it's missing for a lot of people. So you'll see that it's kind of an incomplete picture there. All right, when we get to the racial demographic breakdowns, you'll see, this comes as no surprise to many of the listeners and watchers, Nebraska's a pretty white state, right? 90% of registered voters in Nebraska are white. When you look at these low propensity environmental voters we're targeting, they're also pretty darn white, but less so. Only 80% of them are white. And so what we're seeing in this population of low propensity environmental voters is not only are they disproportionately young, but they're also disproportionately people of color. And a lot of that comes from a real preponderance of Black voters in our target population, Asian American and Pacific Islander voters, and Native American voters. You'll see Native Americans are like 5 times as prevalent in our target population as they are in the underlying like baseline of registered voters. So that's who these low propensity environmental voters are in Nebraska. You'll see there's also an interesting spread here. Now, obviously, you're not looking at over 44,000 individual dots. This is a random assortment that well represents the geographic distribution of our targets. Obviously, a lot of them are in Omaha. A lot of them are in that second congressional district. This is a fairly urban population, but it is pretty spread out, especially compared to many of our other states. There are a lot of small town, ex-urban, and even rural climate and environmental voters in Nebraska. We usually don't see this even a spread in many of our other states. And this might not look even to you, but believe me, compared to states like Georgia and some other states that we work in, this is very even. Now we're drilling down on that second congressional district. So Omaha is under this huge pile of dots that represents low propensity environmental voters. And you'll see up top here, we've identified 18,052 of these registered super environmentalists in the second congressional district who are unlikely to vote this year. These are the people we will be targeting in the second congressional district. And to give you a sense of how that stacks up politically, well, the first congressional district in Nebraska is an R+9 district. That means, on average, in recent federal elections, that district votes 9 points more Republican than the national average. In the first congressional district, we've identified a little bit more than 15,000 of these low propensity environmental voters. In the third congressional district, R+29, we've identified fewer than 10,000 of our target voters. But in the all-important Nebraska second, a district that is so close it doesn't even have a partisan lean. It is literally not more Republican nor more Democrat than the national average. It's currently represented by Republican Don Bacon. In that super tight congressional district that also happens to carry an electoral college vote with it, an electoral college vote that literally on its own might determine who the next president of the United States is. I hope I haven't made you throw up with anxiety yet. In that district, we've identified 18,259 of these super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote. And again, not to put too fine a point on it, but we literally know them by name and street address. And we've got close to 300 randomized control trials that we've run over the past few years, isolating which messages work best with which of these voters to do one thing and one thing only, and that is get them to the polls. We know who these people are, and we know how to turn them into better voters. And this is an enormous opportunity. Whether you live in Nebraska or whether you just recognize how crucially important Nebraska is to the climate movement and to democracy, this is a big opportunity. We also have state legislative races going on in Nebraska this year. As many of you know, Nebraska has only one legislative house. It's a unicameral legislature. You'll see Republicans currently have 33 votes. There's 15 Democrats and one independent who caucuses with the Democrats. Recently, one person just moved over from being a Democrat to a Republican, and that gave Republicans a 33-seat filibuster-proof majority. In 2022, so the last time there were elections, 8 of these races were decided by 5 percentage points or less. So there are a lot of very, very close races. Now, I'm not going to try to pretend that this House is close to flipping in any way. It's not. But it is right on the edge of delivering filibuster-proof majorities for a Republican governor. And so this is also a really important sort of high leverage opportunity. All right, I want to get to the Q&A because we've got about 15 minutes left. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A folder and Peter will be able to throw them to me. But just before we get to that, I do just want to go on this final slide and let you know that we have a $125,000 budget for Nebraska this year. About 20% of that will be spent in the first and third congressional districts, and the overwhelming majority of it will be in the second congressional district. We will not just be keeping our powder dry for this fall. Now, don't get me wrong, we are going to go big this fall with phone campaigns and digital ad campaigns and direct mail campaigns. But what we are also going to be doing is mobilizing these voters over the next month. Because on May 14th in the state primary, there are not only some important elections, but it is a crucially important opportunity to talk to our target voters early. And the reason that's important is twofold. One, dozens of studies show that if you get someone to vote for the first time, it then becomes so much more likely that they're going to vote again. Voting is a potentially sticky, habitual behavior. And the second reason, yes, I am going to now say it for like the fourth or fifth time tonight. Whether you vote or not is public record. So if we're able to get even just a few dozen of these low propensity environmental voters to vote for the very first time next month, it only then takes a few months for the record of them having voted to show up on public voter files. And then it's like there's this bright red beacon next to their name saying like, hey, look at me, I just voted in this low turnout election. And everybody who is running for Congress or state ledge or president of the United States sees that. And it's like they hear a bugle call calling the cavalry, and they rush to those voters. They knock on their door. They say, oh, you should vote for this person. You should vote for that person. They poll them to figure out what issues they care about. And it's like we have pushed them into the pipeline. And now they're first-class citizens. They are voters who not only drive policymaking, but determine who wins and loses elections. And so that's why even the next month is very, very important for these races. All right, we're going to go to the Q&A, but before we start, I do just want to say, in the chat, there is a donation link. Please go ahead and open it up. Go ahead, open it up, and make a generous donation. If you donate through that link, it will be earmarked to our Nebraska work. You can donate as much as you want. There's no limit donating to the Environmental Voter Project. If you want to spread your donations out and make them monthly recurring donations, we love that. Go ahead and please do that. And then finally, if you want to get a bunch of your friends together and have me talk to them about our work at the Environmental Voter Project, I would love to do that. They don't need to commit to donating ahead of time. We are going to pitch them and ask them to support our work. It's too important not to. But please reach out to us. You can email me at nathaniel@environmentalvoter.org, or you can email all of us at info@environmentalvoter.org. All right. Let's get into the Q&A. Peter, what do we got? We got any good questions?
Yeah, so Nathaniel, the first question is a question that we've seen pop up quite often in the past. Why are environmentalists just not turning out to vote at the rate that maybe we would want them to?
Yeah. Good question. Yeah, why aren't these people voting, right? Jeez. Well, there are some things we know and some things that we don't know. Let me start actually with what we don't know. Social scientists are very good at setting up experiments that tell you how to get people to do things, right? Like those randomized control trials I went over. What social scientists are not terribly good at is the opposite, figuring out why people don't do things. Really, the only tool they have is to poll them. And when you poll people and ask them, hey, why aren't you doing this thing, like voting, that society views as really important? Guess what happens? They lie their pants off. They lie their pants off. It's what pollsters call social desirability bias. If you ask people why they aren't doing something that they kind of know they ought to be doing, they tend to not give you an honest answer and instead give you what they think is the most socially palatable excuse for not doing that thing that they know that they're supposed to be doing. And one of the very first studies we ever did at the Environmental Voter Project, if you go to our website to the Reports and Studies tab, you'll see it way at the bottom. I think it's called something like, Why Do People Lie About Voting? Goes into a lot of really interesting detail about this phenomenon. But for now, I just want to reiterate, you might think you know the reasons why environmentalists don't vote. Maybe up in your head, you think, oh, I bet they think that politicians aren't responsive to their issues. Or maybe they think that it's not going to make a difference. Look at this study and you'll be surprised. Because what's really interesting is that super voters think the same things. And so it's really unlikely that those reasons are actually causally related to environmentalists not voting. All right, that's what we don't know. Now let me tell you what we actually do know. The first thing that's going on here, which is leading to lower turnout among environmental voters, is remember some of the data that I was telling you about Nebraska. These voters are disproportionately young. They are disproportionately people of color. And one thing I didn't mention, but I will now, is they also tend to be lower income. Now, what do those three demographic groups have in common? Young people, people of color, and lower income people? They all vote less often. So part of what's going on here is merely a demographic correlation. But it's a demographic correlation that has a lot of, I'll go ahead and say it, evil actors behind it. We don't think of the environmental movement as having a big voter suppression problem, but it does. I mean, think about it. If anybody anywhere is trying to make it harder for someone to vote, chances are they are targeting people of color or young people or lower income people. And that right there is the beating heart of the modern environmental movement. And so, yeah, voter suppression is a big, big problem for us. And that's why a lot of the Environmental Voter Project's successful messaging deals with teaching people how to vote, what they need to vote, and trying to convince them that it's actually pretty easy and straightforward so long as you do X, Y, and Z. So that's one thing that's going on. The second thing that I'll just bring up, and we don't have direct causal evidence for this, but we've got a lot of indirect evidence showing that this is almost definitely something else that's going on. And that is that for a long time, the environmental movement has been weirdly apolitical. And I know a lot of people don't like to hear this, but just bear with me for a second. If you think about what it means to take action on climate or take action on environmental issues, chances are the first things that pop into your mind are something like recycle, change how you get to work, change what you eat, change the electricity you consume. All of which are really important and impactful, but they're also oddly apolitical, right? Like, would you ever hear someone who cares about reproductive rights talk that way? Would you ever hear someone who cares about guns talk that way? Yet in the environmental movement, we don't automatically think of political action or systemic change as what it means to be an environmentalist. We think about how we can change ourselves and our own personal behavior. And this isn't our fault. It's by design. There's been a very sophisticated, well-funded PR campaign run by fossil fuel companies for dozens of years, essentially trying to convince us to just ignore that coal-fired power plant back there and instead worry about that plastic water bottle that's in your hand. It's all your fault, my friend. And we bought it. We bought it hook, line, and sinker. And there's no doubt in my mind that that is a big part of why people who care deeply about climate and the environment are so politically disengaged. We're not used to viewing this problem as being a political one. And so we also don't view these solutions as being political ones. So it's a very, very good question.
Thanks, Nathaniel. So, another question is asking where we get the all of these data for our environmental voters. How do we get the data to identify them? And as a follow-up to that, can you speak a little bit about um, volunteer experiences when they're communicating directly with voters, good versus bad, and what feedback generally seems to be from our volunteers?
Absolutely, absolutely. So this may end up being the last two questions because we've only got about 4 minutes left. So I just want to warn people that if you still have questions, though, please put them in the Q&A and we'll try to answer them after the fact by emailing you. Okay, so where do we get this data? The first thing is I don't have enough time to go over the whole process of how we identify these voters. And so please do check out that short YouTube clip that Peter is going to put in the chat. But as you might remember, the process goes something like this. We will poll huge numbers of people, isolate the ones who tell us that climate's their number one priority, then try to learn a lot about them and find other people like them so that ultimately we can assign a score to every voter in the voter file in Nebraska, telling us which ones are the most likely to list climate as their top priority. So what I believe you're asking is, in one of those middle sections, what data do we use and where do we get it and what's it like to try to learn more about those people who told us that climate's their number one priority so we can find other people like them. Okay, so the first thing that I'll just say is we don't want the data. Oh my God, the Environmental Voter Project doesn't want the data. So we actually never get it. The data scientists who we hire go out and get it and then build these models for us based off this polling, and then we work with them to fine tune the poll. But where do they get it from? Basically from three buckets. One, public voter files. Two, census data. And then three, publicly available behavioral and consumer data. So what do I mean by that? Like, if you go and buy a sweater at the Gap and you sign up for their mailing list, you better believe you're signing up to let Gap give that mailing list to everybody under the sun who wants it. Same thing if you buy an electric vehicle. Same thing if you shop at Patagonia. Same thing if you subscribe to National Geographic. It's all publicly available data. We only use publicly available data, but there's a lot of it out there. There's a lot of it out there. And if using some of that can help us identify millions of unlikely to vote super environmentalists at a moment of great crisis for the climate and our democracy, you better believe we're going to use it. Now, unlike some bad actors in this space, we only use publicly available data. But yeah, it's a very powerful tool to help us find these people. And then to answer the final question, someone asked a little bit about the volunteer experience. So let me walk you through the three ways that people volunteer with the Environmental Voter Project. Door-to-door canvassing. We're not door-to-door canvassing in Nebraska, so I'm going to breeze over that. Just most of our targets are not close enough together to really have it make sense year in, year out. Volunteers also do postcarding and phone calls. Postcarding, the experience is great. You sit with your buddies, we give you a script, you write postcards, we show you that the script that we give you has been proven to increase turnout in randomized control trials, and you can feel great because you're making new voters. As far as phone banking, actually the same thing applies. We never ask any of our volunteers now to do anything unless we have tested that message in a previous randomized control trial and can prove that it increases turnout. And that's something that's really special. That being said, I'm not going to pretend that every single conversation you have is filled with like roses and people telling jokes to each other. That's obviously not the case. However, volunteers consistently report to us. In fact, it's so consistent that even in like our messaging software called Slack, we have an entire like category called words of encouragement because people like send us all these happy messages all the time. They consistently report back that it's a really surprisingly pleasant experience. And that's for a few reasons. One, remember, we're not asking our volunteers to try to twist people's arms and convince them to vote for one person or to care about this issue. No, we're just calling these people up and saying, hey, do you intend to vote on election day or early or by mail? It's what a behavioral scientist would call a choice architecture approach, right? We're calling people we know are awful voters, and we're asking a question in such a way that makes it really hard for them to say, oh, yeah, no, I'm not going to vote. And it's like a trap. They end up saying, like, yes, I'm going to vote, and this is how I'm going to do it. And then we can follow up with them and say, hey, I want to remind you that you voted. So it's a lot easier. The second thing that volunteers report is that the people they call have fewer conversations than other people. Now, don't get me wrong, we're heading into a big presidential election, and a lot of these people are going to be getting phone calls. But remember, we're only targeting the worst of the worst voters. These people aren't deluged with calls like many other folks are. And then the final thing is, because we spend so much time and yes, money identifying these super environmentalists, the overwhelming majority of these people you reach out to care deeply about climate and the environment. So again, I'm not going to claim that every call is perfect. Some of the bad calls are just people saying like, no, no, I'm busy. Why are you calling me? And they hang up. But a lot of them are far more pleasant than you might imagine. And we have randomized control trials proving that they make a difference. And the final thing I'll just say on this is if you're thinking about it, but you're not sure, just give it a try. You show up, you get trained, you hop on the line, you use a proven script. And you know what? If you don't like it, stop, hang up, don't do it again. No one's forcing you to do this. But I'll close by saying this, because we've come to the end of our time. You're here tonight for a reason. You're watching this for a reason. I'm sorry, like you've outed yourselves. You are here because you care deeply about the climate crisis. You care deeply about the democracy crisis. And you recognize that we are going through a crucially important moment in time. And you want to make a difference. You want to make a difference so bad that you're hanging out on Zoom in the middle of the evening on a weekday to learn about this work. You're here because you want to make a difference. And what we have at the Environmental Voter Project for you is we have already individually identified over 44,000 low propensity environmental voters in Nebraska. We have already run close to 300 randomized control trials, isolating which messages work best to turn them into voters. And now all we need is the donations and the volunteers to make it happen. And so before we close, please do me a favor. Please go into the chat. You'll find that donation link and click on it. Because we all know what happens after a Zoom call, right? It closes and then you can't access the chat. And you're like, oh, where did that link go that they shared? So just click on it now, open it up, and please give generously, not as a favor to us. You shouldn't care about us. We're strangers who run a nonprofit. Do it for yourself. You want to have an impact. Do a favor for yourself and start having that impact, because there is nothing I would like better than to be able to start reporting back to you all of the voter contacts and all of the increase in voter turnout that we're delivering in Nebraska. So thank you. Thank you to Peter for running such a tight ship and answering your questions in the Q&A and in the chat. Thank you to all of you who spent your time with us this evening. What an amazing crowd. And both of us hope to see you online or see your donations come in over email. Have a good night, everybody.